Every visionary has a story to tell. These stories educate and inspire us all.
You could hear them cranking up in the morning and hear the click, click, click of the roller coaster.
It's really feeling satisfied and feeling gratified with bringing happiness to young children, especially families.
Working with people who are having a good time is so much better than any other job.
Join us as we learn from these trailblazers.
From an early age, I was always interested in aircraft and vehicles. Wanted to be an aircraft designer. Grades in math were very poor in high school, so automobile design was the next choice because it didn't require any mathematics. Went to the Art Center College of Design, graduated, went to the Ford Motor Company at age 20, and being born in Los Angeles, I could see within 2 weeks living in Detroit was not a future. So there went my college education, all the time wasted. So I returned to California, set myself up in business as R.H. Gurr Industrial Design with a little J.C. Penney invoice pad and a little rubber stamp. During the course of doing that work, I had a contact again with Art Center College of Design, where Walt Disney had gone down to the school to see if the little body for the Autopia cars for the upcoming park called Disneyland could be a student project. I remember Walt had very little money left attempting to build Disneyland and thought that he could get away with a class project for no charge. But anyway, there was a job placement officer there who asked me if I did outside work. Well, I didn't, but I said yes. Next morning, I was asked to go to the Disney studio and met Dick Irvine, the head of design for Disneyland, and away we went at a 27-year career at Disney. Well, amusement parks all over the world always had little cars, what people loosely call those bump cars. In any event, the collection of attractions that Walt Disney wanted to see at Disneyland would include a bump car. They were looking at a German car that had been produced in the hundreds, but it was a kind of an ugly, crude-looking thing. The salesman was trying to sell these cars to Walt, but Walt had the idea that he wanted his own Autopia car, something that nobody else had. He had a small company near the studio design a little chassis, with a little one-cylinder engine that they could drive it around the back lot and see how this would work. But the man that was designing that chassis did not know how to design a body. So therefore, I was asked to go out there and design the body for the car. Very shortly, I found out that Walt assumed that since I did styling work for bodies, he assumed I did mechanical design. I didn't have the courage to say that I'm not trained in mechanical design. I don't have a degree in engineering. So I simply said yes and plowed ahead and learned how to design cars as we were designing and building the 40 Autopia cars for Disneyland's opening in 1955. Autopia was definitely very problematic. We had a number of attractions or parts of the attractions that had great difficulty within the first week or two. The Autopia car, we had 40 cars that we built. One was a special car for Walt, 2 were police cars, which meant we had 37 actual ride cars. At the end of the first week, we had 2 cars left running. What that meant was that we didn't have enough chance to test the cars in an actual test service to determine what the deficiencies were going to be in the car. So this meant I actually had 37 prototype test cars, which meant anything I designed wrong in one car, multiply that by 37 times. Also at the same time, we didn't have any mechanics available to repair the cars on the ride itself. They were repairing other things. I wound up with my own tools and my own car parked next to the Autopia ride, repairing the cars myself every day, and at the same time determining what was wrong and what we were going to redesign and what new parts we were going to need. So this was really the engineering education of how do you take a bump car that's a special car for a new park called Disneyland, and engineer it on the fly while the ride is running. This was quite a long summer, but before September, October of '55, we actually got those cars running extremely well. Most little bump car tracks around the world had curbs on either side, and the cars could freely drive and bounce off the curbs. But that was quite a safety issue, because a lot of times the kids wouldn't pay attention, and they'd lean over the side of the car and go around the corner and put their hands out on the outside of the bumper, and then, of course, you know, they bang into the curb and they've damaged their fingers. Aero Development up near Santa Cruz had a ride very similar in size to the Autopia ride, but it had a center guide. They had figured out a system that you could steer the car with kind of a sloppy spring-loaded steering, which allowed the kids to think they were driving the car. But if you let go of the steering wheel, the center guide would steer the car in any event around the track. That meant you didn't have to have bumpers on the outside of the car contacting the curbs. Remember, Walt was trying to do a themed park. We didn't call it theme park until years later, more than, say, a typical amusement park that would be, you know, rather small type of a park. This was a big challenge. It was broken down into different lands. All these lands were themed. In many cases, the ride equipment was custom built just for Disneyland. All of this meant that not only were we doing literally an experimental park, we were doing an experimental park with a lot of experimental equipment. Now, Walt was very patient. If something didn't work, he didn't go around and blame people for doing something wrong. He simply took the attitude that, well, if that's not working, we'll find something else that will work. So that put us in the mode of constantly evolving the designs, evolving the way operational procedures would work, evolving ever better materials and components so that we could get better and better reliability. After maybe only 1 or 2 years, we found that we could design and build and operate some relatively bulletproof equipment, because we learned firsthand how hard service that these vehicles and other show action equipment is going to get. So we literally did our own engineering from the ground floor, literally as a test park. By 1957 and 8, we had a pretty smooth running park with some very unique rides. Yeah, Walt had a kind of a sixth sense as to what people were capable of doing, even though they'd never done it, never given a thought to do things. He didn't, you know, give somebody a task that, you know, was going to fail. But he would always ask somebody to do something that he had this kind of, again, that's kind of a sixth sense, that if you did one kind of a task, you might be able to do another kind of a task, even though it's not directly related to what your usual line of work would be. Now, this turned out to be very, very successful, because a lot of people were quite surprised that they could actually do things that they had never attempted in their life until Walt asked them to start looking at it. And that became sort of the norm throughout all of Walt Disney's wet enterprises that was doing all the design of the parks. Yes, I worked on all 4 attractions at the World's Fair. The primary one, which I started in 1961, was to design and engineer the Ford Motor Company Magic Skyway. And that was a long-term job, obviously. It went from the middle of '61 up to opening in April of 1964. But sort of in phases, he asked me to do more and more work on some of the other attractions, such as the original GE Carousel of Progress had some animated figures, so I began to develop methodologies that we would use for those animated figures. I was working on the Small World. I designed the boats and the basics of the boat system. Also was asked to design some of the show action equipment, such as the little turntables that have dancers on it. These designs are still running today in our Small World attractions. Then sort of at the last minute, in late 1963, he said, Bobby, I want you to design the new Abraham Lincoln mechanical animated figure. So that meant I'm going to do something quite beyond wheels. So that meant I had to now stop and learn all about the engineering of human bodies, how they move, and how we're going to build all this stuff. So it was a big surprise to be asked to design a really thorough animated human being. Not somebody big like Grover Cleveland where I could get all the parts in, but a very tall, thin guy where we had to use a lot of air-driven servo cylinders that were very big, so there was very little room inside the body to do that. Also, there was a lot of motions that we had to have, and the body also had to be very, very lightweight compared to what had been built before. So I saw Abraham Lincoln as an airplane. You know, a steel tube airplane fuselage using small Fafner control bearings. I saw, you know, an entirely different way to look at an animated figure, which was almost, in a way, vehicle-based. At the time, it created quite a sensation because people went to that show at the Lincoln exhibit and couldn't believe that that's an actual machine that looks just like Abraham Lincoln. In fact, people would throw small items at the face knowing that it's an actor and get the actor to flinch, and Lincoln never did flinch. So Walt's idea was, well, they're going to pay for our development of the shows, and then we're going to take most of these pieces of show and we're going to put them in Disneyland. So that was a good piece of economics, but at the same time, it sped up our development of, in the particular case of what we call AA figures, or audio-animatronic figures. So by the time we started the Pirate Ride, we were now able to develop a system of mass production of animated figures, where we made a lot of the parts out of investment cast stainless steel to minimize a lot of the custom machine work. We found ways that we could combine standard parts into almost any posture for any kind of figure, whether it's a human or an animal. So we reached a period from 66, 7, and 8 where we literally had the world's biggest audio-animatronics factory. And that all came out of all the development of the World's Fair. This is basically a case of doing an upgraded design based upon the developments we'd already done up to that date. But we did take advantage of certain things in Florida, like for example, the water table is very high. You have to do a job which we call mucking, which means taking out all of the plant material and bringing in good soil. We had to actually build the Magic Kingdom above the water table, and we did that by building an underground set of tunnels and opening a lake much bigger by taking the material from the lake and piling it up over the tunnels. So this meant we got into a lot of civil engineering and hydrology and the control of water flow and canals so that we don't ruin the environment there, which is basically a jungle environment. So in that respect, the civil engineering part was the new task that we had to do in order to get ready to build what would be conventional buildings and the attractions that we were used to. Many of the other attractions that I worked on, they might seem strange or frightening to some people, but not really, because they're all sort of related one to another. Simple examples: after I had retired from Disney, I formed my own company, Gurr Design Incorporated. Well, there were so many projects I worked on after Disney. It became quite a variety of just totally wild, different, and unrelated attractions. Some of them, for example, was Michael Jackson came out to see some animated figures that we were doing at a small company where I was an engineer. And he just offhanded said, can you design a lighting device for my new show? So within about a 9-week period, we designed and engineered about a $250,000 lighting attraction that was a great big apparatus that was on a stage that would go through 27 different venues in the course of a summertime. And we called it the spiders. There's two great big lighting devices that would chase him around the stage and then kill him on stage, and he would disappear into the stage and reappear in about 20 seconds later in another part of the theater. So that meant I could now learn how lighting is done in the rock and roll industry. At the same time, I was talking to a guy who wanted to do a flying saucer for the closing ceremonies of the Olympics at Los Angeles, 1984. And the guy was having a lot of trouble trying to do it, and then finally he had a contract to do it. At the last minute said there's not enough time, not enough money, and he handed it to me to say, okay, you figure it out. So I had no fear to do that because I already had a company and working with some friends. In 5 weeks we designed and engineered a flying saucer that was weighed 4,000 pounds, it was 50 feet across and had hundreds of lights on it, and was flown by a big helicopter. And that was a show that was in a 15-minute window. In other words, it didn't have to last 16 hours a day and last for years. That was a one-shot deal for worldwide television. So that meant an entirely different set of constraints. This thing, you could cheat and do a lot of stuff lightweight, but this sucker is better work. People always want to see King Kong. We think 30 feet would be just about right for King Kong. And my take on that was the bigger the figure gets, there's more space inside relatively for all of the structure and all of the working equipment. And oddly enough, it's easier to design a really large figure. Now that weighed about 13,800 pounds and had 660 pounds of gorilla fur on it. It was quite a creature. It actually it animated quite easily. It ran for years and years until it was burned up in a fire after 21 years of service. We actually did 2 more for Universal Studios in Florida. 2 of them. One was 55 feet hand to hand when he held his hands all the way out, and then another one when he stood all up at his full height, he was 42 feet tall. So yes, those were really big creatures. All of the things you want to do to have a believable show business in an attraction, you have all the details that you're going to have. And banana breath was quite obvious because, well, gorillas like bananas. I think the guys that impress people the most, that ought to be paid attention to, are the ones who, from the top of their company, are able to work with working people right down at the bottom level, and even with their suppliers and their subcontractors. So the inspired president at the top of the company is talking specifically to the worker at the bottom doing the actual design or fabrication or research. The people who do that really do extremely well. 3 guys that stand out is Walt Disney, because that's the way he worked. Steven Spielberg, that's exactly the way he works. There's literally no middle management. It's Steve and everybody else. And then the same way here in Las Vegas, you have Steve Wynn. He does the same thing. He's really comfortable talking with anybody at any level in any company, doing the exact work that he wants to see done. So it's a very interesting way to lead.